Hello, welcome to EDFGC5806. This week we're continuing what we started on last week, namely diversity, equity and social justice, and we're looking at policy and practice and with one particular case study based on a primary context and also relating it to a report which illustrates those considerations in respect to secondary schooling. Learning intention this week is to explore the implication of policy on learning opportunities for students in classrooms and also provide two examples from a primary and a secondary setting, from primary and secondary settings might be a better way of phrasing it. So first of all then, how do schools and institutions address disadvantage? Because that's where it all fits in respect to obviously equity and diversity in respect to backgrounds at a local level. If we look at the profile of a school, now we might use the My School website, for example, or even just go onto the school website. The profile of a school and the context in which it is situated will often determine the degree to which these responses are evident in regard to disadvantage and equity. Incidentally, the My School website, as I've mentioned before, that is based on the My School website is where the NAPLAN data, which we talked about a few weeks ago, is published. And the NAPLAN data is processed through a lens, kind of an equity lens, the ICSIA score, the index of socioeconomic advantage, I think it's called, score. So that means that the scores, when the school is rated, whether or not it's kind of pushing above or below the average is related in the context of similar schools, and that's where that idea of disadvantage and equity fits in through the ICSIA index. That's evident in the My School website, which also has information about the type of funding that the school is attracting, and getting an idea of the kind of general populations, the context that the school finds itself in. The main issues confronting schools are related to low socioeconomic background, race, ethnicity and disability. There are others, of course, youth mental illness, drug and alcohol dependency, carers, adolescents as carers, which relate more to individuals really than the general student population. Having said that though, there are a number of examples. In fact, I can name an example literally like 2 doors down from where I'm sitting. At Federation University, only just this year, there's opened up a connection to one of the local high schools, which is for young mothers, so adolescents as carers. So it's actually a program that's in place there to make sure that those young mothers aren't disadvantaged, that they can continue on with their schooling even though they've got a child. So it's an initiative that's very much seeking to explicitly address or prevent disadvantage and inequity by making sure that these people, these young women, and I think they're all women, I don't think that there are actually any guys who are carers. I'm assuming that they're mothers, I could be wrong in that. That their schooling isn't hampered, so that they actually have the same opportunities as young people their age without children. I've given you a case study which is from Worth Primary School, and the link, I would really encourage you to have a read of that because it's a really interesting example. It was written by Maxine McHugh, whom the name probably rings a bell. She's a journalist. She used to be on television quite a lot, and she was a member of Parliament. In fact, she got John Howard's seat in the election when he lost his seat and Labour came to power. She was only in for one term though, but anyway, she has had a pretty long-standing interest in education, and as a result of the Gonski funding report that was of its time, if you like, and that's still being spoken about and still kind of re-emerging in new iterations of it. This book came out, and you got a case study of, which is one chapter of it, looking at Roseworthy Primary. That particular example, I think, is interesting, partly because it's an encouraging story of something that's a really positive story of how a school is helping and influencing the learning in kind of a context that's against the odds to some degree. Because it contextualizes disadvantage and social factors and how the school is fulfilling a really important role in addressing that and battling, if you like, entrenched poverty and intergenerational unemployment and so on through providing these students with really meaningful education. It also connects to curriculum. So there are actually a number of things that were spoken about in this subject. Curriculum links as well, and evidence-based practice, which we touched on, I think, in relation to how the school is using that to inform its practice. In particular, the Australian Early Development Index is mentioned because that's a consideration that the school is seeking to address, which fits in with the idea of it's a socio-cultural consideration in respect to the home lives that the students coming to the school have, and the fact that they're not necessarily so equipped to make the most of school unless the school really explicitly addresses these things. So it's the use of that and the connection to it. It's also an example of a local response to a national assessment policy and large-scale assessment in the form of NAPLAN, because that's the results of that has been really quite important in informing the change. It's also providing a measurement to explore the success really of all these interventions. It's also providing partnerships between the local school, Roseworth in that case, and non-government organisations like the Smith family and other philanthropic organisations. Again, it's a real similarity to where we find us, where I find myself at least in Gippsland, where there are partnerships with a number of schools. In fact, one of the subjects I'm teaching, a literacy subject with the second year undergraduates, part of their ongoing program is to work at learning clubs organised by the Smith family, and those learning clubs are actually hosted at a number of local schools. So there's examples close by of those kind of partnerships happening between various organisations and schools for the benefit of addressing students' needs. It also provides state-based policy, or a context of state-based policy initiatives that are aimed to really haven't typed this very well, to revolutionise public schools in the context of Western Australia. And you can follow that hyperlink to find out more about it. So that's one area of equity and social justice, and the policy triggers, if you like, that manifest in respect to what goes on in the classroom and what goes on in school life. The other part of the coin that we're looking at, and probably looking at more in this lecture really, or in these slides, is to outline the policies that underpin the provision of senior secondary education through the following points. From HSC to VCE, the introduction of VET or VET, introduction of VCAL and some funding considerations, the impact of results-driven measurements of achievement, which are actually evident in both these examples, and the impact of vocational pathways and VET programs for students, again, who are not particularly academically inclined perhaps, but that there's still an equity perspective there in making sure that they can lead a fulfilling role in society and have access and actually achieve success and employment, etc. Connecting back though to the Maxine McHugh book, there's a foreword, and I haven't included that in the reading for the reason that under the copyright restrictions you can put in one chapter, which is the case study chapter you've got, but I wasn't sure if I could include this, so that's why I'm just putting it up on the slide. It's a note from David Gonski, who is of, school report funding fame, and he's writing about acknowledging the fact that so much of what he was trying to raise in his review of funding of schooling that he chaired, which is the Gonski report, is actually evident in these stories. And the whole book has a number of different examples of what schools do to make a difference. And I've just shared one with you. It's quite interesting because it is illuminating some of the really positive stories of why schools make a difference and how schools can be quite creative in generating that difference, how to educate, and not just the funding aspect, but to use that freedom, if you like, and really scrutinize and examine the practice that goes on in order to address equity and social disadvantage. Also, he is making the point that, he's looking at how the concept of equity really is illustrated in this book and how it makes a difference. Also highlighting the requirements and the importance of these issues. So anyway, I'm not going to dwell on it. You can certainly read it, but I just wanted to put it in context so you understand where that case study sits. There are various means that schools use to address advantage and inequity. Some of these, and in fact probably all of them, are pretty evident in this case study, which I'm assuming that you've read. Looking at the community awareness, inviting participation in various cultural activities. In fact, if you look, it might not be so evident necessarily in the case study itself, but have a look at the website. You've got the link there to this particular school. They've changed principles since the case study was published, so there's a new one there which you can see on the website, but it's still clear how a lot of these considerations are making an impact on school life. Looking at the partnerships as well, that was talked about in the case study. Welfare programs and goodwill, getting the right people in there, which I think is again pretty clear in that case study, which I think is really encouraging for everyone as a teacher, that we individually, we do make a difference, or we have the potential to make a difference, and that's something to consider and something that's important, I think. We're going to build on what we've just spoken about and shift the focus slightly to a secondary school focus. And as I said, that case study you just looked at in the primary context relates to the idea of funding and the funding report by Gonski. Certainly, funding is a key area that schools address disadvantage through by seeking additional funds, for example, and being careful how they spend those funds, prioritising things to meet the student body. Also, often schools are very proactive in seeking grants, targeted grants, such as disability support programs, to again help address disadvantage or potential disadvantage. There are also a number of policies that is another way of doing this. It can be quite generic, like anti-discrimination policies, or again more targeted policy to cover students. It can be students who are unable to purchase uniforms and books. Again, the Smith family have got a number of grants that they're working with particular students to facilitate the whole schooling life. And you can look at more examples of that. They're examples I happen to know just from the local context. I don't know who the kids are, obviously, but I know that those programs are in place in quite a lot of schools. School community awareness. Again, celebrating a diverse perspective, including cultural awareness activities, information nights, maybe seeking alternative ways. And in fact, you can see that I know that I'm supposed to be talking about secondary schools, but if you look at the website of that Roseworth, they've got a new SMS thing that they're talking about for absences. So it's school community awareness in respect to keeping the communication channels happening with parents, for example. Partnerships as well, working with businesses and agencies to improve outcomes and opportunities for young people, welfare programs, and again, goodwill. So looking then really at the secondary education focal point, the transition from the Victorian High School Certificate, the HSC, to the Victorian Certificate of Education some time back was actually recommended. Again, it's an idea of policy driving what we actually see happening in the classrooms and what we see happening in school life. There was a ministerial review of post-compulsory education, often called the Blackburn Report, and you've got links to it later on. This was conducted in 1985, so it's a long time ago. And it included the collapsing of technical schools and high schools into a single post-compulsory education system with a single school completion certificate. So the idea of not, differentiating or making almost not really value judgments, but segregating those previously, now it's part of one whole. So as a result, several school completion certificates offered by technical schools and high schools for less academic students were brought under that umbrella of the new VCE. The Blackburn Report argued that higher participation in the final years of school should be encouraged, which is something we hear all the time still, because of equity, labour market considerations, and the benefits to the society and the individual. Also, the Blackburn Report argued that post-compulsory school must meet both the needs of those continuing to higher education and also provide broadly useful skills for those who move directly into the workforce following Year 12. So how does that then impact on disadvantage and inequity? Well, there are a number of recommendations that were handed down in the Blackburn Report. For example, the goal was that 70% of the student body, should participate recommends a goal of 70% participation to the end of Year 12 by 1995. So that's some time ago, but it's interesting to see to what degree that goal was met. Also, the Blackburn Report recognised that some schools and districts already were achieving that, but also that there are districts with low-income families and significant and disadvantaged families that are not, at the time, weren't meeting the targets. I'm not sure if they are now, but that's just me. I don't know to what degree this has been examined. Also the Blackburn Report argued that higher participation by disadvantaged group can be achieved if the change is made in the structure of financial support and the provision of post-compulsory schooling itself. And a lot of these changes have certainly been implemented, so we can track that. But that's, again, the instigation from a report to policy to how that then impacts in the classroom. The Blackburn Report stresses the importance of financial support, particularly for disadvantaged kids, and you can look at an executive summary at the end of this PowerPoint. The introduction of VET, or Vocational Education Training in School, VT courses, were introduced to the VC to support technical education for students. And the VT subjects are provided at the local level by a registered training authority and part funded by the government. Most subjects are listed by the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority, and they do contribute towards the students getting a VCE ATAR score. And in practice, the VET subject will often involve students in going to another setting, like a TAFE or training centre, for a few days per week. So kind of mixing it up and relating it into an authentic context, if you like, a lot of the time, and a flexible solution. If we then look at what difference this has made, well, it has enabled all students, particularly those who are seeking apprenticeships and training, an opportunity to study in non-academic courses. And in respect to disadvantage and inequity, this has actually provided access to courses through schools that have enabled students who may otherwise have been unable to successfully present themselves for apprenticeships. It's enabled them to seek employment and participate in getting work. In 2002, a new Victorian Certificate of Applied Learning, VCAL, was added. And in recognition that the academic pathway in the VCE wasn't attracting enough young people to engage with post-compulsory education and training, this was added as a pathway available for students, so an alternative, if you like. The target was that compulsory education would be upwards of 95%, so that's an increase from the original report, which is pretty promising. VCAL courses are now offered in most schools and include VTIS as a subject. They've attracted really large numbers of students for whom the VCE wasn't particularly suitable, and it's providing broader access in the final years of schooling. In many schools, the VCAL program has provided a pathway for students who might kind of fit some of these descriptors. They might be weak in literacy and numeracy skills for a number of reasons. They might have poor socio-emotional development. They might be on the disabilities program. They might have an indigenous or ethnic background, and they might have behavioural issues. So it can be several of those, or it could be aspects of it. But certainly for these students, the VCAL program is a really good alternative that is, again, providing equity and opportunities for students. Number of funding issues and the policies that underpin the three aspects of post-compulsory schooling, VCE, VTIS and VCAL, are designed to provide choice for students. At the school level, the resources for provision of choice are quite limited, and the availability of programs offered through these training organisations can make it even more difficult. Sometimes schools will decide to either reduce the VCE, VTIS or VCAL curriculum depending on the ethos and the demographic of the student backgrounds, and often schools cluster together into networks to increase provision for students, making it more workable, so kind of working smarter in a complex situation. The programs have provided flexible pathways for more students than was previously available through that single certificate of VCE. And with the current high youth unemployment, these pathways aren't always translating into further training, apprenticeships and full-time employment, but nevertheless that doesn't mean that they're not valid. Federal funding for vocational education is really important, but it is subject to changing expectations. You can see an example there of Australian technical colleges that became trade training centres and that are under review. These slides were actually developed by Cheryl Glary last year, so I'm not sure if that review is ongoing, but certainly they have been reviewed. And us being in an election year, it's probably a case of watch this space. If we're then looking at results-driven accountability measures, which is important because it's a sign of the times we live in, that a lot of things are measured and we're looking at impact factors, etc. Each year, the publication of post-compulsory school completion results in the media and as part of on-track data has an impact, and an important, big, significant impact on how schools are viewed. Schools accountability data looks at the number of mean study scores for the VCE, and one impact of this is for schools to seek to establish separate cohorts so that the VCAL classes are measured on a different scale apart from the VCE students. There are a number of policies that relate to this in regard to creating equity in access to educational attainment, such as the establishment of the VCAL, but also a way of addressing entrenched lack of equity for students who are not expected to do well at VC. There are alternative measures, so we can have a look at the policies relating to that. So, in sum, schools and other institutions generally work against the grain to implement policies that address disadvantage and inequity at the local level, despite lack of funding and resources. And you've got some examples of kind of sunshine examples, but a lot of the times it's quite difficult for schools. Case study, if we look at the Blackburn report or the Grossworth, well, probably more applicable actually for the secondary. Case study of the development of a single certificate post-compulsory school completion qualification and its transition to multiple certificate status highlights the ways in which educational policy may set out to improve outcomes for social justice, and in fact they might have a different impact. Doesn't mean that the individuals and their teachers will have a negative experience sometimes out of adversity. There are actually some really interesting and great things that are achieved at the schools. Now you have a number of references there, and the reason why they're so dark is because I just checked that all those hyperlinks definitely are working. So have a look, because you can see both the Blackburn report and a number of the different policy documents and info sheets about these various programs that are quite helpful, I think. Also, I should point out, next week you're out on placement, so it's pretty much a space for yourself to keep working and developing your understanding. I will not prepare a recording for it, but all this is leading up to your school investigation and reflection. And when you are out on placement, before you go out on placement, actually have a revisit and look at the assessment recordings I've recorded, so that you know you're going to be on the hunt for some policy and some evidence of that policy at play when you're out on placement. So have a look for that, so that you know where you're tracking and relate it back to the different issues we've been speaking about. Thank you.